Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And welcome to This Thinking, an attempt to understand, or at least try to understand the meaning of Merkel, what she's done for Germany in our understanding and appreciation of Europe and to diplomacy, and to ask the question of what comes next. Our thinkings, if you've not been before, and this is a digital one, are intended to be as chaotic but determined as a good news meeting. Everyone should weigh in, share their stories, tidbits of information, big ideas and opinions, and at the end I hope we'll come to a slightly better informed point of view. They do also, as you may have noticed, start with a song, and if you are, as I have been racking my brains trying to work out who is that, that is first and foremost my colleague Mark St. Andrew's idea of a good time. Mark St. Andrew is one of our colleagues who runs the Thinkings, and he always tries to find a piece of music that can, if you like, set the world of news to music, and that was Herz aus Glas by, I think, Mariam Herzberg, the Blondie cover. I had slightly guessed that Mark was going to go with Bob Dylan, You're Going to Make Me Lonesome When You Go, but it turned out he'd had a much better idea. So Mark, thank you for that. This evening, I hope that we will get a better understanding of what Merkel has meant to Germany, to Europe, and to the world more generally. I'm embarrassed to say that at the end of her time in office, I find myself still reaching for a bunch of cliches and caricatures when it comes to thinking about her and her time. And so the fact that we have in Alex and Stefan and Constanze and Sebastian such a mix of people with such a depth of knowledge, I feel very fortunate. And rather than go for big ideas at the beginning, I'm going to start, if I might, by asking each of the four of you just to tell us a story of Angela Merkel, if there's an experience you have, and I might start, if I can, with Alex Stubb, the former Prime Minister of Finland. But Alex, I was saying before everyone joined that you were one of the few participant commentators during the whole Brexit referendum that seemed to be both on the inside and making sense of it with a little bit of distance. Can you do the same for us on Angela Merkel? What was your personal experience of her like?
Yeah, sure. Perhaps I should make a personal sort of preface first, and that is to say that I'm a great fan. So whatever I say, you should take with a pinch of salt. But I was quite fortunate that in my year in the European Council, I was sitting next to Angela Merkel, because that's the way the rotating presidency works. And she, for all intents and purposes, I guess, took me under her wing and helped me out a lot. I must say it was helped a little bit by the fact that our small talk was done in Germany. But my anecdote is probably one that very few people in the world can match. And that was that I ran the Berlin Marathon in September 2014 as Prime Minister. And that was a Sunday, and I was going to have my official first visit with the German Chancellor, official bilateral visit the next day. And, we decided that why don't we have a few drinks beforehand on Sunday evening. So I just ran the marathon, and she came over to our ambassador's residence. And we spent a rather long and very pleasant evening chatting about the world and world affairs. Her husband was there as well, the ambassador, and then myself. But of course, the next day, you're not only hungover from the marathon, but if you're hungover from some wine, you're not going to be at your sharpest. So the situation was such that you have the official welcome with all the flags and soldiers and fanfare and all of that. And there's this little pedestal that you have to stand up to. And, I was walking like a duck because you're just so shot after a marathon. So when we got to the pedestal, she looked at me and she said, "Brauchst du ein bisschen Hilfen?" So she lifted me up there onto the pedestal. And not only that, it was even worse coming down. So, we have it all on camera, and people must have thought, oh no, there's another Finnish prime minister, drunken Finnish prime minister. But no, it all turned out good. So nice that 3 weeks before the election, she came to an official visit to Finland, but both of us stayed sober at the time.
Alex, can I ask you? You said you sat next to her at the European Council. Is she someone who murmurs or mutters or says things under her breath? Would she lean to you and comment on what people have said, or is she quite disciplined like that?
She's very disciplined, but there are two things that you have to do in the European Council. One, you have to know the minute details of the conclusions, which means that you need to be well prepared, and you will have to have a team that prepares you well. And secondly, you need to be able to do the interventions, and she could do both. She was one of the rare ones. There are those who can give the big speeches but don't know the details, and then there are those who know the detail but can't do the speeches. She could always do both.
Well, I want to come to her conduct as a politician, the nature of her politics, and the way that impacted. But I'd like to get some stories, if I might, from Constance, Sebastian, and I'm going to put you, Stefan, first on the spot. It's slightly unfair, given that you're the sort of official biographer of Angela Merkel. You've got nothing but stories about her. What share one, share two? What do you think is the best way of understanding her?
Well, just probably two very brief ones. One, first, I'm not the official biographer. That's something the British publisher put in the book to make it sell better. So I thought to withdraw the book from British English publication. And then I came up with the idea and went back to the Chancellor and said, listen, I wrote this book and I did it and it's coming out soon. There's an English publisher, but he demands to have that on the cover, otherwise it's just dead. So Merkel had this issue being pushed to the legal department, and her aides came back 2-3 days later and said, no worries for us, do whatever you want. That's part of her sort of way to sell herself. But one of the more sort of interesting stories was I was invited to go along to a trip to the United States in 2011, actually as a guest of honor, which was probably unusual for journalists, but I took it on because it was the official state dinner she got from President Obama, and when for him to get to a state dinner at the White House. So I went along, and we had that wonderful rose garden setting and full moon, and just a spectacular scene. So the evening went on, and usually when you go to a state dinner afterwards, the invited party has sort of their after party somewhere at the hotel. Not so with Angela Merkel. She's as sober as she can be, dragged us all into the vans and waiting buses and limousines, drove out to the airport, and we all entered the German Luftwaffe plane in our tuxedos and nightgowns or evening gowns, and changed dress or changed into sort of normal wear on the plane, because she couldn't bear spending another night in Washington, want to get back to work. Very typical for her.
There's so many of these stories. We published a piece by John Kampfner about the night of the wall falling, and one of the stories that I thought was amazing was that night that she again went to work, because it was a night that she was due to go to work, and she decided to go another time. I want to get to that work ethic in a minute, but Constanze Stelzenmüller, I know that you have written at Brookings and for Foreign Affairs about the sort of impact of Merkel on Europe and the transatlantic relationship. I'd like to come to that geopolitics, but do you have a story of her that you think is telling?
Well, I used to be a journalist, but I wrote about foreign and security policy and tried to stay out of the way of ministers generally and ministerial trips, and certainly I wasn't taken on chancellor trips. But I have been a regular at the Munich Security Conference, and I remember, and this is what I opened this foreign affairs sort of retrospective piece with her. So those who might have read that will already know this story, but she can be quite tedious to listen to. And I was sitting on these sort of jammed in with other people on the ballroom stairs of the Bayerischer Hof, where she was giving a speech a couple of years ago, and I just couldn't focus. And then I realized that the guy sitting next to me was the head of her military policy unit, a brigade general. And I sort of tugged at his sleeve and said, so, what's it like to work for her? And it was really just to keep myself awake that I asked that. And he looked at me and then said something that I found absolutely mesmerizing and really suddenly made me wide awake. He said, working for her, working next in her vicinity is like working next to a nuclear power plant. It just runs and runs and runs. And I thought that was an extraordinarily powerful metaphor for this woman who really does have a work ethic second to none. And who has, despite her sort of deceptively, down to earth behavior and language, has been one of the most powerful people on the planet for 16 years.
Mm-hmm. Constance, thank you. I think you're right. Part of the reason we wanted to have this conversation was actually to mark a moment. I can't think in my lifetime of leaders in Europe that have had the same impact. You'll think about Merkel, you'll think about Kohl, about Mitterrand, you know, there are a few of them, but actually given how many people are in the news, it's amazing how few of them make that kind of impact. And I suppose you need to have a pretty strong nuclear core to be able to keep that energy up for that period of time. I'm going to come to Sir Sebastian Wood. You were the former ambassador for the UK in Germany. I don't know whether there were things that you ever wrote in the cables, Sebastian, that you can now finally tell us. But just start with the personal. Was there anything that personally struck you about her?
Well, we have a declassification process after 30 years. So if we do this again in 30 years, then I can say a bit more about what I wrote in the cables. But yes, I do actually. I was fortunate enough to be invited to a big charity gala dinner in the Adlon Hotel a couple of years after I'd arrived in Berlin, and the lady who organized this event put me on the top table with the Chancellor, with Angela Merkel, and it was only a small table. There were sort of 4 or 5 people on the table, and I was sitting opposite her, and the whole event lasted about 2.5 hours. And she basically held forth. I mean, she has this very, as we all know, this very disciplined sort of public presentational style, and she tends to sound, you know, quite technocratic. She sort of eschews, you know, any sort of flamboyance in the way that she presents her ideas publicly. But I was struck by how different she was in private. She was very sort of voluble. She was processing, I think, in her mind, something about what was going on in German politics and the rise of, you know, the AfD in popularity at the time. And she just sort of held forth in this very voluble way with a lot of humor as well, which again, you don't see quite so much of in her sort of public, quite a sardonic sense of humor. And I think I drew 2 conclusions from this. First is that like all very, very super busy people, she probably didn't have much time to think. So when she was plonked down in a situation like that, where she wasn't actually working, you know, or having to represent Germany in an international meeting, or, you know, chairing a meeting of the cabinet or whatever it was, she was using it to think, and she was just basically thinking out loud. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was hearing. But the other thing I thought, and I do not mean this to be in any way a criticism or insulting, but I remember somebody saying to me about Tony Blair that after he'd been prime minister for 10 years, he had been in charge in every situation that he'd been in for so long that he kind of stopped listening. Yeah. You know, he simply talked. And that was very much the feeling that I got from Angela Merkel that evening, that she was now 99.9% on broadcast and you know, wasn't really listening so much. I think she obviously was still capable of listening when it was very, very important for her to kind of pick up what was going on. But she, you know, make no mistakes, behind the scenes, she was an extremely, almost like a domineering personality in my brief experience.
Sebastian, that's interesting. I wondered whether, look, the nature of thinking is we want to make sure there's many people as possible weigh in. So if you've got a thought or an observation, please do. If you've got a comment on the way in which she impacted Germany, Europe, or the nature of politics, we'd love to hear from you. I wonder whether we can start with something simple, which is her scorecard as it relates to Germany. And I wonder, Stefan, whether or not I can ask you first, is what do you think when you stand back and you take the 16-year view, you look at economic integration, environmental reform, immigration, and the changing nature of politics in Germany, how do you, if you're being as dispassionate as possible, do you score her?
Well, I mean, 16 years is a hell of a long time, and we have gone through numerous crises in this time. Don't need to repeat them, but there's 1 or 2 overlying themes which I would score her very high on. First is the notion of stability, predictability, prosperity. This is something Germans could rely on, and actually the country fell back on. So I would give her an A or A minus on this. Also on sort of majoring European crises, keeping Europe together, and by that actually leading Germany into a position which it historically is actually quite dangerous, being their sole, well, hegemon is not the right word, but definitely the directive power of Europe. During those 16 years, the French role had diminished. The British were on their way out. So all of a sudden, she found herself in a position which all her historical predecessors probably would have found awkward, because all of Europe would have balanced against Germany, not so with Angela Merkel. So that's extremely high. Now, on the small issues, the day-to-day issues, we can go in far more details, mostly environment and probably also the notion of to keep democracy alive in Germany. And that's what we see actually right now in the campaign, that the country seems to be like deplored of the notion that democracy lives of fight, of having to frame opinion, of making choices, and actually forcing people to take hits or two. So this is something the German public is pretty much deprived of, and we probably will learn on a very hard way over the next months what it means to have a much rougher patch or stretch in our history with a much less stable government.
Constance, how do you answer that question? Merkel's scorecard within Germany?
Well, I mean, my feeling is I sort of very much agree with Stefan Cornelius. It's, you know, it's a mixed bag. I do think that she was a supremely capable and, as the ambassador was saying, increasingly dominant political figure who was, I think, particularly good at crisis management. The thing that she, I think, had less control over was the sort of unintended consequences of some of her most striking decisions, such as taking Germany out of nuclear energy after the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, which, as your charts showed at the beginning, has made us more dependent on coal and on energy imports from, among others, Russia. And of course, the I think, in my view, humanitarian and responsible decision to not close Germany's borders to migrants in 2015, but which had a lot of knock-on effects on European and indeed on German politics, giving a sort of burst of oxygen to the German hard right. And finally, I think,
just on that, can I just ask you about that?
Sure.
Do you think, because I think probably most people outside of Germany, if they look back in 25 years' time and are asked what did Merkel mean, they will make that point about the surge in migration. That will be what comes to mind when they think of Angela Merkel. Do you think that that burst of oxygen to the far right, as you put it, will last, that there's a structural change in German politics as a result? Or actually you're going to see effective immigration of that 1 million plus migrants into Germany?
So it's a complex question. If you don't mind, I'll sort of dissect it. One thing that's really important to note, and which people keep getting wrong, is that she didn't open Germany's borders, she refused to close them. There's an important legal distance, because under the Schengen regime, our borders were open, and she would have violated those rules if she had closed them. And much more importantly, I think she made a perfectly accurate assessment that these migrants were already causing public order crises in the countries where they were, as it were, piling up, and that closing our borders would have exacerbated those conditions, whereas we were really the only country in Europe with the governance and economic capabilities to take them in. Bizarrely, then it turned out that civil society did quite well at absorbing this inflow, whereas municipals and regional government struggled, and I think that's what made Germans so upset. Now the AfD, I think, feels as though we're a little past its prime. Right. It appears to be plateauing. It, I think, has radicalized so visibly as it's you know, the extreme right with links to neo-Nazis and identitarian movements has clearly won the power struggle within the party, which means that it is an impossibility for any of the other parties to work with it. And as a result, it has painted itself somewhat into a corner. However, the permanent change that I think it has made to the German political landscape is twofold. One, it has, as political scientists say, this is a wonky term, but it's used a lot, so I'll use it. It has changed the Overton window. In other words, it has changed what is acceptable in public discourse by violating taboos very intentionally all the time. And the other thing, of course, because it now sort of occupies...
Constance, sorry to interrupt you, yes? Because I think I might misunderstand you. Do you mean it's moved the Overton window and made it more permissible to say things yes. that are rude and nasty, yes. or made it more permissible yes. to say things that are open and inclusive?
No, I think more permissible to say things that are rude and nasty.
Oh, I see.
Now, I'm sort of a committed liberal, so I feel that I think that it was actually quite helpful for the AfD to be airing things in public which were, I think, previously swept under the carpet. Part of this was also Merkel, of course, triangulating the CDU towards the political middle, squeezing the Social Democrats and leaving room open at the right that had always been scrupulously covered by right. previous conservative politicians. Now, one final point, which is important, because the AfD appears to have a solid grip on about 10, 11% percentage points of the German electorate, at least in the polls, what that means is that it makes it far less likely in the future that Germany will be run by a two-way coalition. It complicates election and coalition mathematics. Oh. It will make coalition negotiations more onerous. And if it takes as long as last time, which was 5 months in 2017, yes. that will make us inward-looking at a time when we shouldn't be.
Constance, that's fascinating. Thank you. While you were talking there, some people are asking questions about or posing thoughts about Merkelism, about the nature of her leadership. I'm going to come to those, if I might, in a moment, but I just want to come to Alex and Sebastian. And Alex, this question about the nature of her leadership within Europe that Stefan mentioned, obviously you were a partner in that and party to it. I suppose the questions that are put about her leadership in Europe more critically would be this: a softness towards Russia and a failure to get to grips with some of the values issues between the countries of the East and the countries of the West. A question about whether or not the structural reforms of Europe moved fast enough in her time. And I'm thinking they're more about economics and a more integrated single market. And then within the UK, with my UK hat on, I'd say there's also been some question about whether or not she did enough to try and keep the UK in the European Union. So I wonder whether you would sort of do the scorecard on her record as a leader within the EU.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think political obituaries, especially when they are, from a person who's been for 16 years a chancellor of Germany, are always going to be a mixed bag. You're going to succeed in a few things, you're going to fail in others. And I quite often say that, use the term president, it's not the president that makes the agenda, it's the agenda that makes the president. So you could also say in this particular case that it's not the chancellor that makes the agenda, it's the agenda that makes the chancellor. And, I've heard good words about her being a crisis leader, but that's in the nature of modern democratic politics. You basically go from one crisis to another, and the sequence is always the same. You have crisis, then you have chaos, and then you have a suboptimal solution. And that's what we saw on the European sphere as well. I mean, the key here was that she was a very avid pro-European, more so, I would argue, than Schröder. probably on the same playing field with Helmut Kohl, and thus she can be put into that category. Now, you mentioned Russia and you mentioned values. Remember, I come from a country with 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia, which makes it a little bit more difficult to manage and discuss than it does, for instance, if you're coming from an island such as the UK. I think she got the balance right. I mean, I was there as foreign minister negotiating the peace in Georgia in 2008. I think she said all the right things. On Ukraine, on the Crimean Peninsula, and I think on Donbass, she did the right thing. I think Nord Stream 1 and 2 were rather complicated for her, precisely because of the Fukushima decision on nuclear power, which I think was a mistake. But, you know, again, Energiewende was what it was. But her style of leadership was, I think, very good for Europe at a time. You talked about structural reform. Remember that was it not for the financial crisis and the crisis management that was done during that, we would have never, ever in any intergovernmental conference gotten as far as we did in terms of banking union, European stability mechanism, surveillance mechanisms, et cetera, et cetera. So she did a lot on that as well. I think on COVID, she did a lot of good crisis management. On the UK, James, I hate to put it to you, it had nothing to do with the German Chancellor. It was just the fact that British media was bollocks on Europe for 40 years. Sorry for saying it so blunt.
Well, I think that's a yeah, I think that's an insight that a lot of people are going to nod their heads to. I can see a few heads nodding there. But Alex, can I just do two things on that, just on the specific? Firstly, just to unpack this Nord Stream issue, because I think the relationship between the nuclear decision post Fukushima, the commitment to Nord Stream, and the extent to which that made Germany more reliant and less able to stand up to Russia. Do you think that that's going to be a structural problem in the way in which Europe deals with and Germany deals with Russia into the future? What's going to be the long-term impact of that Nord Stream decision?
Well, it's going to be a power balance issue, and obviously Nord Stream should be seen purely as an energy issue. But obviously, if you ask our Baltic friends, they're not going to see it as such, nor are you going to see anyone from Poland making the argument that it's just pure energy. It's a lot about geopolitics and power politics. I actually feel quite comfortable with the power balance and the fact that there is this sort of back and forth in the relationship. Now, what Finland has done with its energy package is basically to be independent enough by having enough nuclear, having enough own production, having enough renewables, so that we can afford to take 100% of our gas, which is only 10% of our energy box, from Russia. So if that's turned off, we can go to alternative solutions. So there's always going to be this power balance. The truth is, however, on Russia, and I know this is not about Russia, but Russia is, unless Russia modernizes its economy, which looks very unlikely at the moment, because still 50% of its annual state budget comes from gas and oil exports, it's not going to become part of, how would I say, the Western community. And we can also see it in the elections going on in Russia at the moment. But that's a different story. But I think, she's played her cards extremely well, Merkel has, in all directions. And that's what a political leader should do. So she has not put Germany at any stage into a disadvantageous position in any direction. And I'm not going to mention other political leaders in Europe who seem to be doing that quite frequently.
But I'm going to come back to that. I just want to go to Sebastian, but then I'm going to come back to you on that, on the nature of leadership, because there's some interesting points in the chat. Sebastian, obviously, you've seen Alex has slightly knocked me off my stride because he can swear so vividly in what's potentially his third language, and I can't come close. But the point I think I was trying to make about Merkel and the UK and Brexit was there were certain people, and certainly I think David Cameron might have made this point in 15-16, and Ed Llewellyn, who worked for him as the chief of staff, there were these arguments that the UK was putting to Merkel, can you put in place a quote unquote emergency brake so that the Brits can actually say, or Cameron government can say to the British people, look, we've got a control on immigration, stay in the EU, And the argument that's been put to me was that Merkel didn't take it seriously enough, and as a result didn't push through that emergency brake, and the British people never got told there was an alternative on immigration. Now, some of that may be true, none of it. Tell me how you think Merkel's role played into the UK and Europe.
Well, yeah, I think her whole style as a politician was to operate within the bounds of what was politically possible, and then wait for an opportunity and then move. We've seen that in areas, including the sort of steps towards more economic integration in Europe. I'll come back to that point in a moment. To be fair to her, I don't think she saw much possibility really, or any possibility of moving further in Cameron's direction in that sort of European reform debate that came before our referendum. And to be honest with you, you know, as old and senior as I am, a lot of the details of that renegotiation escape me now. But I recall that my impression was at the time that we got a little bit more than quite a lot of people had expected, including on the migration policy question. But it turned out that it just wasn't enough to win the referendum. And it was almost as though the results of that negotiation about European reform almost seemed irrelevant to the referendum campaign which followed in any case.
Do you basically buy Alex's point that in the end, it was the media, the state of British politics, perhaps a whole bunch of domestic considerations anyway? There was nothing really that the German Chancellor had done.
I think, put it this way, you know, the fine print of some arcane intra-EU discussions about precisely what the rules should be on free movement and emergency brakes and so on would have been completely overwhelmed by the images of, you know, hundreds of thousands of desperate migrants pouring towards Europe from Syria and Afghanistan in that summer, you know, summer of the year, the previous year before our referendum. So.
And Sebastian, can I ask you a different thing, which is, how has Merkel made a difference to the way in which the UK Foreign Office sees the diplomatic map?
Do you mind if I don't answer that question? Because I don't have a ready good answer, but there are a couple of things I did want to quickly say in response to your earlier question, which about, you know, what she's done and hasn't done in Germany. I mean, first of all, in terms of German domestic politics, there's a martial art, which I'm sure everyone's heard of, called Aikido, which I don't pretend to be any good at it myself, but my understanding of Aikido is that you basically use your opponent's energy to sort of cause them to fall over and make a fool of themselves. And I think Merkel sort of Aikidoized German politics. That was the way she did it. And it created a bit of a you know, it took a lot of the excitement, it took a lot of the sort of hand-to-hand combat out of German politics. Arguably was a contributory factor in the rise of the AfD. But it's very interesting to me, you know, to see within weeks, you know, as soon as a campaign starts where Merkel isn't running and the candidates are actually beginning to sort of fight, that the energy is that sort of combative energy is flowing back into German politics quite quickly. So I don't think that'll be a sort of lasting legacy of Merkel's, but it was very much a feature of while she was there. And then quickly, the other point I wanted to make relates to something Alex said about European reform. You know, I have felt for some, she left behind a gigantic building site in EU policy, a Baustelle, as the Germans would say, which is this whole issue of, you know, the deep German opposition to any so-called transfer union, where wealth is essentially transferred from more wealthy member states, in particular Germany, to less wealthy states, you know, on a larger scale than is currently the case inside the EU. And I always felt that German politicians were not really being straight and honest with the electorate, in that, you know, joining the euro had given German exporters a huge exchange rate advantage and enabled Germany to sort of have a fantastic export boom, but at the same time put less competitive zones of the Eurozone, other countries, particularly in the southern areas of the Eurozone, under enormous economic stress. And it was never really articulated to the German electorate that, that's the advantage we're getting. And now, to keep this polity together politically, we ought to, subsidize a bit more, just in the same way that wealth flows from the southeast of England to Cornwall and Wales and less wealthy bits of the UK. And that argument was never made. And she never tried to make it, because her approach was always to wait for for an opportunity to open up and then go for it, rather than to actually very, energetically lead and try to change the terms of what is possible. And what happened, it's very interesting what happened in the pandemic, where the extent, the magnitude of that economic crisis for Europe was big enough for her to see an opportunity and take it. And the pandemic recovery package in Europe, the first time that the EU has issued common debt, it effectively doubles the EU spending power over the next 5 years. And for me, the really interesting question in this election is whether that will now become embedded, and it will be rolled over and perhaps financed by new forms of revenue for the EU, which will mean that it's a lasting boost in the firepower of the Commission, or whether if you get a CDU victory or a CDU-led government in Germany, then I think it's much more likely that Germany will insist that that's a one-off.
But that's so interesting, Sebastian. I mean, I do understand that point, that the benefits of Euro membership that accrued to Germany became its obligations vis-a-vis the rest of the European Union, and have been, if you like, embedded in the EU budget as a result of Merkel.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way that the EU had to sort of address the stresses and strains on the less competitive parts of the Eurozone, particularly up the global financial crisis, was the expansionary bond buying programs of the ECB. And Germany could have turned a blind eye to that, but instead you had a lot of politicians and Bild-Zeitung and so on constantly reminding German savers that they were being cheated of the interest on their savings in order to subsidize sort of spendthrift Southerners. So it's kind of sowed quite a lot of resentment, which now comes out in German attitudes to, the lack of burden sharing on migrants and so on. And this, for me, is unfinished political business in Germany.
So I think I'd love to. I'm going to come, Constance. I'm going to come to you in one moment, if I can. I just want to bring in a couple of people who've made. So in the sort of last 15 minutes or so, I'd love to have a sense of what her style of leadership and, if you like, Merkelism means. I'm going to bring in Owen McArdle and Michael Stewart-Sitchlin in a moment. And then in the last few moments, I just want to have a little bit of crystal ball gazing into that unfinished business, Sebastian, you talked about, and the elections. Owen McArdle, do you want to come first? Because you raised the question about Merkelism. And as someone who's grown up in the shadow of Thatcherism, I wonder whether Germans in 25 years will have a sense of what Merkelism meant.
So, I guess I would start with a point slightly different to the one I was making in the chat. I've just finished reading Stefan's biography, as it happens. So I was interested to see he was on the speaker list. And as someone who's young enough to not really have been conscious of Germany before Merkel at all, Merkel to me was this chancellor who hadn't really done very much. If you look at Adenauer and Erhard, well, Adenauer had binding Germany to the West, Erhard had the economic miracle, Kohl had reunification, Brandt had détente with the East. What's Merkel got? And then I read Stefan's book, and actually Germany under Schröder was quite different to how I kind of imagined it to have been.
What do you think? And then, having read Stefan's book and having put it in that sort of simple sense, do you have a definition, Owen, for what you think Merkel means?
So the impression I got, sort of comparing with Schröder, is in some ways it's almost a reversion to type. in my opinion, a very welcome reversion to type in rebuilding transatlantic relationships, more distancing from Russia, and I guess China's become more relevant recently, and sort of almost Adenauerite Westbindung.
I'm going to put that to Stefan. I'm going to just get to Michael as well, because I'd love to hear. I mean, it's such a brilliant issue that you sort of brought up, which is what is Merkelism, what is the nature of her leadership. There's a different element to this that Michael Stewart Sichler raised also, which was about not ideology but behaviour, about the style of her leadership. Michael, do you want to just the point you made in the chat interested me?
Yes, thanks. It's really just somebody who comes from an education in the 50s and 60s. We were taught to discuss and argue rather than remove the argument from the other people. So the style to me is acutely important. And although I don't have Sebastian's experience or knowledge of what's going on, I like his metaphor of Aikido, of listening, so you can find out where the weak spots are in the other person's argument. And instead of just pushing a fist in their face, you use your brain to organize how to make him agree with you. Because in the end, ultimately, you don't get anything done unless you've got support for it. So you have to make the argument.
So it's an interesting thing. John Kampfner's profile for us of Merkel was a lot about this, about competence versus charisma, a diplomatic style rather than necessarily quite such a sort of kind of forthright charismatic leadership style. Constance, I know you wanted to make a point in response to what Sebastian had said, but I wondered whether you'd pick up too on how you interpret Merkelism and the style of her leadership.
All right, sure.
You're there, I can hear you. Oh, no, it's correct. Constance, you've just shut yourself off. Can I hear you now?
I'm seeing...
I've got you, forgive me, yeah.
Okay, all right. All right, back to your question, Merkelism. I think Merkelism needs to be understood both in relation to German political history, and I think also in the latter years, sort of in contradistinction to the style of Emmanuel Macron, the French president. And it also, of course, has something to do with Merkel's personality as well. Those three things, I think, came together in ways that were sometimes useful, sometimes not. Which is why I keep saying that I think her legacy is ambivalent. The German tradition is post-war tradition in politics is very much sort of balancing and seeing ourselves as a middle power with very little leverage. So we need to have dialogue, even with authoritarian powers. And we need to balance out East and West, despite the fact that we consider ourselves as firmly rooted within the EU and NATO. I think a lot of us today in Germany now think that that strategy has very much run its course, and we need something much harder edged to replace that. Not least because the Russians and the Chinese aren't just sort of doing objectionable things in their own neighborhood, but because they're actually interfering in NATO, in the European Union, and in fact in national politics, including elections. That's one thing. The other thing is this sort of careful, inclusive bridge building and consensus building, which was really, really important in crises, of which there were many, as has been said, but was, I think, not useful to prepare Germans for the fact that Germany, in order to remain resilient and retain its freedom of action with regard to coming crises, will actually have to change quite fundamentally some of the ways in which it does business. It's missed out on industrial and manufacturing transformations, and I think on some political decision making. Yes.
Sorry, Constance. What I meant is how would it need to change the way it does business?
Well, very simply, I mean, we've already mentioned energy policy. Walking out of nuclear made us more dependent in the short and medium term on coal and on gas and on imports. our manufacturing, our extremely intense trade relationship with China, I think has shielded our manufacturing export businesses, particularly the car industry, from making necessary adaptations to new technologies such as the sharing economy, economic developments like the sharing economy, and technologies like AI, and the electric engine, and these things, have a massive impact. We're behind the curve on that, and the next chancellor will have to make those adjustments, and those, of course, have a massive impact on the jobs market and therefore also in politics. Let me make one final point, if I may, on Sebastian Wood's remarks on Germany's Eurozone policy. I'm not going to quibble with that, just to say that that policy came from the finance ministry and Wolfgang Schäuble, and was very much disputed within Germany. And the current finance minister, who's also the front runner in the polls, has a very different take and got Merkel to sign off on the European recovery program, without which surely the European recovery economy would have tanked in the pandemic. And finally, I remember very vividly going to security conferences in the Baltics in the 2010s and having outraged Balts say, why are we not throwing Greece out of the Eurozone? They don't belong there. They don't deserve it. In other words, being 10 times as German as the Germans. And people like me saying, that is not how we see Europe. Nobody gets thrown out of the Eurozone or out of the EU. Our thing is to hold Europe together. And that is where Merkel has been very firm, particularly vis-a-vis Paris, which would like to see much more European integration, if necessary, at the price of losing some folks along the route.
And very effective. I'm going to turn to Stefan Cornelius, if I might. But Stefan, before I do, I'm just going to invite William Jeremy in, because we had a vicar's daughter who lasted not quite as long in office recently. And William's made an interesting point about, or at least asked this question about the nature of the Christianity in her Christian Democrat leadership. William, do you want to make the point? I see you refer to Gordon Brown, son of a Manse too, but why does this interest you?
Yes, partly because of the twin, if you like, pillars of her background, which is growing up in Eastern Germany and also growing up as the daughter of a pastor. And I wondered to what extent this must have influenced her political personality, the way she interacted with her fellow Germans, and also the whole, if you like, Christian Democrat tradition within post-war Europe and post-war Germany. Again, as is my want, it's a big question.
Let me ask Stefan. Let me ask Stefan, because he can, I hope, sort of weave that into what he thinks the nature of what we've learned from her about leadership, and to answer this question about Merkelism. Will you touch on that issue about the daughter of a pastor?
Sure. I'd like to. Well, William's question is extremely broad, and let me try to just put it down to 3-4 sentences. First of all, yes, she was brought up in a pastoral household, but the defining situation of that childhood was much more life in East Germany, in behind the wall, rather than being a Protestant's daughter, a Protestant priest's daughter. Yes, she had Christian beliefs, she had a Protestant work ethics, but most of her forming experiences were that of shielding away from the East German authorities, of growing up as an extremely brilliant and intellectual young woman and girl who was number one in her class in so many subjects, and was refused to study what she wanted. She wanted to become a teacher, but she wasn't allowed to. And this is why she put her brain to work in a different field. And so to me, Merkel is much more an intellectual or sort of a brain child than a pastoral child or a Protestant child. But if you ask about what's Merkelism, I think
Actually, Stefan, I'm gonna interrupt you to that because I'm aware of the time, and I don't want this conversation to end without a look ahead at the elections and what happens now to Germany's politics. So, will you tell us what you think will happen in the elections and where Germany goes next?
Well, these elections are a huge break in post-war German history. It's the first time that we will most likely see a three-party, a three-way coalition, which makes government more difficult. I think we'll have much shorter living spans of governments. It's the first time in post-war history that a standing chancellor is not running for re-election. A sitting chancellor is not running for re-election, and that the governing party will most likely be voted out of office. This is a huge rupture. The electoral landscape is fractured. The middle is crowded. It's not quite visible how to separate those parties. So I think we're marching in the direction of a more Scandinavian model of a centrist party, which can go work together sort of as they please. So that'll be a change for Germany. It will be less stable and less predictable.
Alex, let me ask you then the knock-on question. What do you think then that means for the future of politics and government in Europe?
Well, I mean, I guess the first observation is to say that we human beings have a tendency to do three things. Number one, we over-rationalize the past. Number two, we over-dramatize the present. And therefore, number three, we underestimate the future. I'd be a little bit more relaxed about the election result. Germany is at the center of Europe. And you asked about Merkel's legacy. I think she brought Germany to the center of Europe as the undisputed, how would I say, leader of Europe during her era. The question is, whoever becomes the next chancellor, whether that is going to hold. It usually takes a long time for a person to take center stage. It is easier if you come from a big country. But it does look like, as was noted, that Germany is moving perhaps a little bit more towards Finnish style or Scandinavian style coalition politics. And let me tell you, that's never easy. I was in government with 6 parties, 5 parties, 4 parties, and 3 parties. And it's a constant battle. So whatever happens in elections next week, it's going to take a long time to set up a government. And good luck, Germany.
No, just a serious point though about it. I know our tendency to dramatize the present and mistake the future, as you say. But do you worry about a Germany that is more bound up in coalition government and less able to make decisions?
No, it's part of democracy, and we should not be kidding ourselves. I mean, Germany has obviously been in a coalition government for quite a while now, and decision making in today's world is very complicated. The reason I like your tortoise concept is that this is what democracy should be like. It should be slow and contemplative. That's what John Locke was thinking about when he was writing about it. The problem is that with technology and modern communications, the cycle of politics is so rough, tough, and swift that we're unable to hold on. The strength of Merkel was that she was able to stay calm, cool, and collected throughout all the daily noise.
Alex, thank you. Sebastian, are you energized by the fight that's come back into German politics? Do you think it is going to send the country in a new direction?
Well, it's a very exciting election, clearly. And if we assume that neither the AfD nor the Left Party can realistically be part of a coalition because of the positions that they hold and the amount of, in the case of the Left Party, the amount of indiscipline on their sort of among their MPs, then you've got 4 centre parties. And mathematically, at the moment, it looks like any 3 of those 4 parties could have a majority, or any group of 3 out of the 4 will have a majority. I think on the way the polls are at the moment, so which is a pretty extraordinary state of affairs. I think those watching it closely would probably agree that we're either going to have a union-led, CDU-CSU-led coalition supported by the Greens and the FDP, or we're going to have an SPD-led coalition supported by the Greens and the FDP. in either case, the prognosis is for quite a difficult negotiation of a coalition agreement with the risk of a lowest common denominator sort of outcome. The only attempt in modern times, as far as I'm aware, to negotiate a three-party coalition was at the last elections in 2017, and that failed after months of effort and led to a sort of 6-month gap between the election and the establishment of a new government, with the SPD very reluctantly coming back to work with the union again. This time, I wonder, I mean, Stefan, you may have a better sense, but if it looks as though it's going to be equally difficult to thrash out a detailed coalition agreement this time, I wonder whether we might see a kind of change in the style, the way that these things in Germany are done, that the parties will agree instead on a sort of broader framework for their coalition, and then have the arguments about policy as they go along in the years that follow, leading to that instability that you were talking about.
Well, Sebastian,
yeah.
So forgive me for interrupting, because I'm aware of the time and that we're coming to the end of the hour. I should also say, by the way, we don't know each other well enough to say that I am particularly enjoying the ambassador's cuddly toy, which I actually issue for. But I wanted to finish, if I might, just with Constance, and ask you one question, which is really probably unfair because you're not a mind reader nor a crystal ball gazer. But the final question is Angela Merkel's political career over? Is there a future for her in an international organization, in the EU? Do you think that she's going to do more?
James, you don't need to be a mind reader to answer that question, because she already has, and I think we should take her seriously on that. Which is that she said what she plans to do is to read a lot and to take naps and to be very happy that somebody else has to solve problems.
And this says something terrible of my skeptical journalistic mind, is that I think to myself, I mean, she's available for all.
I think that is extremely credible, and that people, I do think that a lot of people have made grave mistakes based on not listening to her.
Yeah, that's probably right. That's a very good place to end this. I appreciate there's much more to discuss. I just wanted to say thank you. One observation is just on the note that Alex Stubb hit as he started, and saying what an admirer he is. Actually, listening to this conversation, there is one optimistic observation that's worth making, is that not all political careers end in failure. You can have these political careers that are more complicated and certainly more impactful than that. I am struck by the extent to which I probably hadn't internalized the nuclear decision and Fukushima and the knock-on impacts in German politics. I'm actually also struck more optimistically by the way in which the immigration decision has made changes to German politics, but by any measure, ones that you'd probably take if you knew those were going to be the outcomes when those decisions were made. But overall, I really do take to heart this idea, I think it was your point, Alex, that, presidents don't make agendas, agendas make presidents. I'm sure that all of us, even in our far smaller lives, think there's a ring of truth to that. So I wanted to say a big thank you to Sir Sebastian Wood, to Constanze Stelzenmüller, to Stefan Cornelius, and to Alex Stubb for being quite so insightful, both on the personal and the big politics, and for joining us. And I hope that we'll get together and think more about Germany before too long, possibly as that coalition discussion takes place. Thanks, everyone.